My daughter-in-law smiled all the way through my wife's funeral, and 3 days later, in a lawyer's office, she stopped, the exact second he opened a folder and said, "There is a second will, dated more recently." I counted the smiles. I know that sounds strange, a grieving husband counting, but grief does peculiar things to a man's attention, and mine had fixed on the one face in that church that wouldn't stop smiling, 16 times. She smiled, shaking hands with mourners. She smiled at the flowers. She smiled twice at her phone while the priest was still speaking. And she was still wearing that same soft, patient smile 3 days later in the office of a lawyer named Prentice, right up until the moment he set down the first will, opened a second folder, and said those 7 words that drained the color from her face like a plug pulled from a sink. There is a second will, dated more recently. I'm Arthur. I'm 70 years old. And what my wife Margaret did in the last 4 months of her life, while she was dying, while everyone in the family had quietly agreed she was too sick and too far gone to notice anything, is the most extraordinary thing I have ever seen a human being do. But before I tell you what was inside that second folder, and why my daughter-in-law made a sound I'd never heard a grown woman make when the lawyer pressed play on a small recorder, I have to take you back 4 months. Because that's when Margaret started smiling too, a different kind of smile, and I was too frightened of losing her to ask what it meant. Stay with me, because this story turns on a thing my wife understood that the rest of us didn't, and the person it saved was not me. Let me go back. My daughter-in-law's name is Vanessa, and I'm going to try to be fair to her because the comments will want me to make her a cartoon, and the truth is more useful and more frightening than a cartoon. Vanessa was not loud. Vanessa never raised her voice, never said a cruel word you could point to and repeat. Vanessa's whole gift was the smile, warm, concerned, endlessly reasonable, and the soft sentence that followed it. We just worry about Dad, all alone in that big house. Has anyone thought about who handles things if Margaret's illness gets worse? It might be time to simplify before it's a crisis. Every sentence a small hand on the wheel, turning the family a few degrees, and every turn dressed up as care. My son David married her 8 years ago, and David is a good man. I want that on the record because it matters later. A good man who happens to be easily led by a confident woman, the way a good man often is. When Vanessa spoke, David nodded. When Vanessa worried, David worried. And after Margaret got her diagnosis, Vanessa did a great deal of worrying, out loud, about the future. Here's the thing they didn't know about Margaret and me. We weren't poor. We'd never looked like anything but an ordinary retired couple in an ordinary house. Margaret drove a 15-year-old sedan and clipped coupons out of habit, not need. But I spent 40 years as a patent attorney, and Margaret spent 30 running the numbers for a company that did very well, and the two of us together, quiet as church mice, had built something substantial, a house paid off, investments, and a piece of commercial property downtown that neither of our children knew existed because Margaret's rule, I can hear her saying it, was, "Arthur, the moment they can see the size of it, they start spending it in their heads, and people get strange about money they've already spent in their heads." She was right. She was right about everything, which is a hard thing to learn too late and a harder thing to learn just in time. The diagnosis was pancreatic. The doctors gave us months, and they were, for once, almost exactly right. And here is where I have to tell you about my own failure, because I won't tell this story with myself as the hero. In those months, I fell apart. Quietly, but completely. I could not look at the paperwork, could not think about after, could not bear a single conversation that assumed a world without Margaret in it. So when Vanessa began, gently, to raise those conversations. Dad, we should really get some things in order. Dad, David should probably be a signatory, just in case. Dad, have you two thought about updating the will while Margaret's still able? I did what a drowning man does. I let someone else hold the paperwork. And Vanessa was so helpful, so very helpful. She found the lawyer, she scheduled the appointment, she sat with Margaret and me, while a will was drawn up. A perfectly reasonable will, she assured us, one that just made everything simple. I barely read it. I signed where the little flags were. Margaret, thin and tired in her chair, signed too. And Vanessa smiled and squeezed Margaret's hand and said, "There, now nobody has to worry. That will, the one I signed in a fog, the one Vanessa arranged, left the great majority of everything to David, which sounds fine, which sounds normal, until you understand two things I didn't understand then. First, that to David in a marriage Vanessa controlled meant, functionally, to Vanessa. And second, that the will contained a quiet little clause about my own care, a clause that gave David, and therefore Vanessa, authority over my living arrangements, should I become unable to manage independently. A nice community, 40 minutes away, one less thing. I signed it without reading it. God help me, I signed it. But here is what none of them knew, what I didn't even know, not until that office 3 days after the funeral. Margaret read it. Margaret read every word. Because Margaret, dying, foggy with medication, written off by the whole family as too far gone to follow a conversation, Margaret was the sharpest mind in any room she'd ever been in, right up to the last week. And being underestimated by people who love you is a kind of superpower if you have the stomach to use it. Now let me tell you about the 4 months of smiling. Margaret's smiling. Because somewhere around the 2nd month, Margaret changed. Not for the worse, for the stranger. She started asking her old friend Dolores to take her on drives. Just to get out of the house, Arthur. And she'd come home tired and oddly satisfied, like a woman who'd finished a piece of work. She started keeping a small blue folder in the drawer of her nightstand, and once, when I reached for it to move it, she put her hand over mine, gently but firmly, and said, "Not yet." And she started smiling at me at odd moments, across the room, a private smile, the smile of someone who knows a secret she can't wait to give you, but can't give you yet. I thought it was the medication. I thought it was a dying woman making peace. I was so busy grieving her while she was still alive that I never once asked what she was doing on those drives. That's my second confession of the night. I mourned her instead of listening to her. She was working. Right up to the end, my Margaret was working. I know some of you want to know how she managed it. How a dying woman, watched over by a family that had already started dividing her things in their heads, pulled off the most careful piece of work of her life, without a single one of us noticing. So let me tell you, because Dolores told me the rest afterward, and it's the part I'm proudest of. The drives were the cover. Every week, sometimes twice, Dolores would pull up in her old green car, and Margaret would say, "Just getting some air, Arthur," and I'd wave them off, grateful she still wanted the world. And most of those drives went straight to Prentice's office, where my wife, thin, tired, running out of time, sat across a desk and built the thing that would save us, one document at a time. She couldn't do it all at once. She didn't have the strength. So she did it in pieces, an hour here, an hour there, resting between, and Dolores waited in the lobby with a thermos of tea and told anyone who asked that they'd been to the garden center. Dolores said Margaret was different in that office, sharper, younger almost. Dolores said that one afternoon, walking out, Margaret stopped on the sidewalk, looked at the sky, and said, You know what the strange gift of dying is, Dolores? Nobody's watching you anymore. They think they know how this ends, so they stop paying attention. And that, Margaret smiled, is exactly when you can get something done. My wife had turned her own funeral into a blind spot and walked straight through it. And the recorder. I have to tell you about the day she got the recording, because Dolores was there for that too, in the car, terrified the whole time. Margaret had figured out that David and Vanessa came to our house on Thursday afternoons, when they believed she was resting. So one Thursday she told me she was going to Dolores's to nap, and instead Dolores drove her back to our own street and parked 3 houses down. And Margaret, a dying woman, walked in her own back door, sat down in the sewing room off the kitchen, and waited, with a recorder in her cardigan pocket, for the conversation she was almost certain was coming. Dolores said she'd never been so frightened in her life, sitting in that car, watching the house, praying Margaret wouldn't be caught. She wasn't caught. She sat in that room and listened to her son and his wife plan the disappearing of her husband, and she pressed record, and she did not make a sound. And then she walked back out to the car, pale, and said only, "I have it. Take me home. I'm tired now." And she slept the whole way. That is who my wife was. That is what she spent her last strength on. Not on being comfortable, on me. She passed on a Tuesday morning. She was holding my hand, and she was, I swear to you, smiling. That private smile. And the last thing she said, so quiet I had to lean in, was, "Check the blue folder, Arthur." Not before you have to, but check it. And then she was gone, and I forgot those words entirely for 4 days, because grief erases things, and I had a funeral to survive. The funeral, where Vanessa smiled 16 times. I want to tell you it made me angry, but I was past anger, down in the gray flat place below anger where nothing has a color. I watched her work the room in her tasteful dark dress, accepting condolences that weren't hers to accept. Already, I could see it, already mentally rearranging my house. At one point she caught me watching her, and she came over and put her hand on my arm and said, with that smile, "We'll get you sorted, Dad. You won't have to worry about a thing." And I understood, in the fog, that sorted was a destination, and it had a 40-minute drive attached to it. 3 days later, Prentice the lawyer called us in for the reading, and this is where I have to slow down, because the next 10 minutes are the reason I'm telling you any of this. We sat in his office, me, David, and Vanessa, who had insisted on coming to support David. Prentice opened a folder and read the will Vanessa had arranged. Everything to David, the care clause, the nice community. Vanessa's smile, as he read, grew wider and softer with each paragraph, like a woman watching a plan she'd built come in exactly on schedule. When Prentice finished, she actually exhaled. Relief. It was done. And then Prentice did not close the folder. He set it aside. He opened a second one, and he looked, not at me, not at David, but directly at Vanessa, and he said, "There is a second will, dated more recently, executed by Margaret 4 months ago, properly witnessed, and lodged with this office. It supersedes the one I've just read. I have never seen a smile disappear the way Vanessa's disappeared. It didn't fall, it was pulled, plug from a sink, every drop of color and warmth draining out of her face, until what sat there was something I'd never seen on her before, the face underneath the smile. And it was frightened, because Vanessa, who watched everything, understood before David did, before I did, exactly what a second will dated 4 months ago meant. It meant that in the very window when everyone had agreed Margaret was too sick to know what day it was, Margaret had been in this office. On those drives with Dolores, doing this. Prentice read the second will. And I'm not going to be able to tell you all of it, so let me tell you the parts that mattered. The blue folder, the one from the nightstand, Margaret had left instructions that it be opened here, in this room, at this moment. It contained the second will, yes. But it also contained something else, a small recorder, and a note in Margaret's handwriting that Prentice read aloud, and I'll give it to you as close to word for word as I can hold it. Arthur, my love, I'm sorry I couldn't tell you. If I'd told you, you'd have wanted to protect me, and you'd have made me stop, and I couldn't stop. There are things I heard that you didn't. Vanessa doesn't know I heard them. Prentice will play you side two. And Prentice pressed play. I'll tell you what was on that recorder in a moment. But I need you to understand how Margaret got it, because it tells you everything about the woman I was lucky enough to be married to for 44 years. On one of those drives, Margaret told Prentice all of this on the record, and he'd typed it up. She hadn't only gone to the lawyer. She'd doubled back one afternoon to our own house, when she knew Vanessa and David would be there, believing Margaret was resting at Dolores's, and she'd sat in the next room, a dying woman in an armchair, quiet as a church mouse, with a recorder her granddaughter had once given her as a joke, and she had listened. And what she recorded, what played in that office 3 days after we buried her, was Vanessa's voice. Warm, reasonable, unsmiling because she didn't know she was being heard. Vanessa, explaining the plan to a hesitant David, the community they'd move me to, the timeline, once the old man's on his own and easier to manage. The house, to be sold before he gets attached to staying. And the line I will hear until the day I die, the line where David said uncertainly, "It feels wrong, doing this to Dad." And Vanessa said, in a voice with no smile in it at all, "He won't even notice, David. He's barely holding it together. By spring he'll be somewhere safe, and we'll have the house. It's kinder this way, trust me. He won't even notice." She said that in my house, in the room next to a dying woman she'd written off, who was recording every word. The office was silent when it stopped. David had his face in his hands, and Vanessa was looking at the recorder the way you'd look at a snake that had been in your bed the whole time. And here is where I thought it would end, with exposure. With the plan in ruins, Vanessa caught, the house safe, a cold, silent understanding. That's what I'd have settled for. That's more than I thought I'd get. That is not where it ended, because Margaret's second will did one more thing, and it's the thing I could never have done myself, and it's the reason I'm telling you this instead of just quietly winning. The second will did not cut David out. It could have. Any lawyer would have advised it. Instead, Margaret left David his inheritance, but held in a trust that Vanessa could not touch, could not direct, could not spend, administered by Prentice and by our granddaughter, the one who'd given Margaret the recorder as a joke. And attached to it was one more line from Margaret, which Prentice read last, and which broke the room. "David, you are not a bad man. You are a led man, and I have watched someone lead you somewhere your father and I never raised you to go. This trust isn't a punishment. It's a fence. It's me, standing between you and the cliff, one last time, because that's what a mother does, even when she's gone. Come back to us. There's a chair at your father's table, and it will always be yours, but you'll have to walk to it yourself." Real life doesn't wrap up like a movie, so let me tell you the honest after. Vanessa left that office alone. David didn't follow her. That marriage did not survive the recording, and I won't pretend I was sorry, though Margaret, in her note, had asked me not to gloat, and I've tried to honor that. There was no criminal case. Nothing she'd said was quite a crime, only a cruelty. But the plan was dead, the house was safe, and the care clause that would have filed me away into a nice community was gone, replaced by nothing, because Margaret trusted me to manage my own life, which is the greatest vote of confidence one person can leave another. David came back. It took months. He'd come by on Sundays and sit in the kitchen, and we'd learn, slowly, how to talk, without Margaret translating between us, which was harder and better than I expected. He carries a guilt I wish he wouldn't. I tell him what his mother would have. Being trusting isn't a crime. It's just expensive. And sometimes someone who loves you has to build a fence to keep you from paying the full price. The stairs in my house are still fine, by the way. I climb them twice a day. I sleep in the bed I shared with Margaret for 44 years. And the blue folder sits in the nightstand drawer where she kept it. Empty now, but I can't bring myself to move it. Some things you leave where the brave person left them. So here's what I'll leave you with. And it isn't for the young ones tonight. It's for us. The ones somebody has quietly started planning around. The ones being sorted and simplified and gently walked toward a chair in the back of our own lives by people who smile while they do it. Watch the paperwork. Watch who volunteers to handle it. And watch the smiles, because grief reveals people. Some people weep at a funeral. Some people count the silverware. And the quietest person in the room, the one everyone's written off as too old or too sick or too far gone to notice, that person may be the only one actually paying attention. My Margaret was dying and underestimated and foggy with medication, and she still outthought every healthy person in that family because she understood the one thing they didn't, that being underestimated is a door, and a brave person walks straight through it. I almost didn't check the blue folder. 4 days I forgot her last words entirely. If Prentice hadn't called, I might never have known what my wife did for us in the dark. I'm so glad she was smarter than my grief. Now, the comments, and I read every one. Was Margaret right to keep it from me? Some of you will say a marriage should have no secrets, even this one. Some of you will say she did the only thing that could have worked. Tell me. And the harder question, the one I still turn over some nights, if David hadn't come back, if the fence hadn't been enough, and he'd walked off the cliff anyway, would Margaret's gamble still have been worth it? Or is a mother's last act only a success if the child comes home? I think I know my answer. I want to hear yours. And if you believe that the quiet ones, the ones everyone underestimates, the ones who sit still and pay attention while the confident people talk, are the strongest people in any room, then stay with me. Because next time I'll tell you about the son who sold my late wife's piano while I was in the hospital, and the phone call I got 3 days later from the man who bought it, because there was something inside the piano bench that my wife left, and my son never thought to look. Take care of each other, watch the smiles, and check the blue folder, whatever your blue folder turns out to be.